Oh, now, okay. Okay,
Right?
thank you.
Sure.
Okay, this story is entitled Tunnel Refuge. Copyright Robert Rue. It was late September. The leaves were changing colors following a hot summer. The four hikers set out from their campsite on a crisp, sunny morning. They planned to follow a scenic 15-mile trail that passed several points of interest, including an abandoned railroad settlement, a ruined railroad trestle, and a railroad tunnel. The tunnel they particularly wanted to see because it was reputed to be haunted. A ghost and strange lights had been seen there after dark. By their schedule, they would pass through it in the afternoon. The area was hilly and mostly forested. They would cross several streams at bridges marked on their map. They packed a light picnic lunch for the day. They would be back at their campsite for dinner. Dave and Jess led the way down the trail. Dave worked for the State Historical Society. He was familiar with the region and its history, and he had planned the hiking route. A veteran hiker and backpacker, he really enjoyed hiking. Jess, Dave's wife, preferred day hiking. She was particularly interested in ghosts and in the haunted tunnel on their route. Ted and Lori followed them. Ted was a meteorologist that lived in Maine. He and his wife Lori were vacationing and visiting their friends. Lori was a botanist from northern Maine. She was very familiar with the evergreen forests of that state, and she wanted to learn more about the deciduous forests of the Midwest. Their morning hike was hilly but not strenuous. Eventually they stopped for lunch at the abandoned settlement. It had been a small railroad maintenance station built during the Civil War when the rail line had been a mining and ironworks spur. Abandoned when the mines played out in the late 1880s, the rails had been removed and the buildings had long since collapsed. Souvenir hunters had picked clean the entire site, and all that remained were half-buried stone building foundations and piles of broken brick. As they ate their lunch, it seemed a little gloomy in the deepening shade. The morning sunshine had given way to fast-moving clouds, and the wind had changed direction. Dave idly poked around in the soil near the several foundations, but found nothing except a rusty railroad spike. Jess had fallen silent and was looking all around them. The others, sensing her unease, stopped talking. "It almost feels like we're being watched," muttered Jess. "Does anyone else feel it?" "Perhaps, now that you mention it," said Dave, "but I don't see anyone else around." Ted, ever attuned to the weather, was looking at the approaching clouds with some concern. Catching up on each other's news, they had taken longer for lunch than they had planned. Now it looked like a front was approaching faster than expected. "Remember that storm predicted for later tonight? Looks like we're going to see it yet this afternoon," said Ted. "Do you think we can still finish our hike? Or should we turn around and go back now?" asked Lori. "I'd rather not miss seeing the tunnel," said Jess. "I've heard so much about it." "I don't know if it'll get here before we reach camp. It might be close," said Ted. "What do you think, Dave?" "Go for it," said Dave, smiling at Jess. The others agreed and quickly packed up to leave. They continued along the trail for half an hour or so, and soon came to the ruined trestle. The bridge deck was long gone. Only 5 sturdy stone and mortar piers, rising about 12 feet above the level of the stream, remained. They were evenly spaced, obviously linking the higher ground on either side of the stream. The stream itself was swollen from recent rainfall, and that presented an unexpected problem. The trail went straight into the stream and out the opposite bank. The large stepping stones marked on the map that usually provided a bridge across the stream were invisible under almost 18 inches of muddy, fast-flowing water. "Some bridge," grumbled Jess, poking for the stepping stones with her staff. "Don't worry, you won't melt," laughed Dave. He approached the edge of the stream, preparing to splash across on the stepping stones. "Wait a minute," said Ted. "What about that big tree trunk over there?" He pointed upstream, where a huge old sycamore had been undermined and fallen across the stream. "Are you going to tightrope it?" grinned Dave. "This I have to see." "No, but we can scoot across it one at a time," Ted explained patiently. "We'll stay dry that way unless we slip off and fall in. It beats soggy shoes for the rest of the day." "Sounds good to me," said Laurie. "Shall I go first?" "I'll go," said Ted. "My idea, so I'll try it out." Ted tightened his pack, then climbed onto the smooth tree trunk and lay down. He eased forward along it, several inches at a time. The tree sagged under his weight, but over the middle of the stream he was still about 3 feet above the water. Stopped by a branch stub that blocked his path, he pulled out his hatchet, sat up, and expertly chopped off the stub. Next, he smoothed the sharp edges left around the stub, restowed his hatchet, and continued inching across. He slid off onto dry ground to the applause of Laurie and Jess. He did a mock bow and smiled. "Okay, your turn, Laurie. Just stay centered on top of the trunk." Laurie climbed onto the trunk, leaning forward rather than leaning on it. She boosted herself over the area of the stub and scooted the rest of the way without mishap. The tree trunk stayed well above the water. "That was easier than I thought it would be. You're up, Jess." Jess approached the tree trunk hesitantly and clambered awkwardly onto it. "Go on, you can do it," said Dave. Jess tentatively began to inch her way forward. She tried to copy what Laurie had done, but moved much more slowly. She reached the area where the stub had been and stopped. "Now what, Laurie?" "Just grip the trunk on either side of the stub, slide up onto it, and then ease forward over it." After a few tense moments, Jess was over the stub, and she scooted the rest of the way across. Her smile went from ear to ear as she slid off onto dry ground. "I did it!" The others laughed and applauded. Now it was Dave's turn. Dave climbed onto the trunk, then stood up. "I'm going to tightrope it," he said. He slid one foot forward, then the other. He walked along the tree trunk to just short of the water's edge, which was when his back foot slipped a little. He jerked forward, arms flailing, and finally jumped onto dry ground. "Fooled you," he laughed. He climbed back onto the trunk and scooted across like the others had. "Well, it was worth a try." Suddenly a loud peal of thunder boomed in the distance. As they climbed the bank and followed the trail forward, clouds had begun to block the sun. It became strangely dark for early afternoon. The storm was coming. Ted broke out a small radio and listened to it as they continued through the woods. "Uh-oh. What is it, Ted?" "This county is under a severe thunderstorm warning and a tornado watch until 4:30 today." They all looked at the sky. The clouds were almost solid now, blotting out the sun and growing darker by the minute. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. "We'll need to find shelter somewhere." "Yeah, we don't want to be under all these big trees in a thunderstorm." "How far are we from that tunnel, Dave?" "Oh, maybe a mile. It's hard to tell from this map. We have to cross a big open area after the woods we're in now. We'll be on the old railroad bed part of the way." "Do you think we can get to the tunnel before the storm hits?" "Never mind the rain, but we'll need shelter from the lightning and any high winds." "Maybe we should move faster. Let's trot." They jogged along the trail, occasionally glancing up at the darkening sky overhead. The wind had died completely, and it was as dark as dusk. Trees stood motionless around them, as if bracing for the storm. They broke out of the trees and trotted into an open meadow where the trail joined the old railroad bed. They crunched along the gravel and cinders for a time. Then they saw the mouth of the tunnel in the distance. Large raindrops began to spatter all around them. "Here it comes," muttered Laurie. "Let's run for it." They broke into a run on the curving railroad bed. The tunnel was still about a quarter of a mile off when they heard roaring that was not part of the approaching storm. Looking back, to their horror, they saw a funnel cloud smashing its way through the woods they had just left. Pieces of trees and branches were flying through the air. "Tornado!" shouted Ted. "Into the tunnel, quick!" Now they were running as fast as they could. Then a dense sheet of rain obscured the funnel cloud behind them. A huge bolt of lightning struck the ridgeline near the tunnel. It blasted apart a tree trunk. Branches crashed down, and the massive trunk split right down to the ground. Thunder roared immediately overhead, and the ground shook. The skies ripped open, and rain poured down in sheets. They could scarcely see the tunnel entrance. "Come on, we're almost there!" Dave had to shout to be heard. As they pounded along the railroad bed toward the gaping mouth of the tunnel, they saw a dim light off to one side, just within the tunnel entrance. A man was motioning them to hurry, and was gesturing towards an open door in the wall of the tunnel. As they dashed past him into the tunnel and through the open door, none of them got a really good look at him in the semi-darkness. They all remembered his pale face, with bushy eyebrows and a huge soup strainer mustache. But each recalled a different detail. Dave noticed that his left hand holding the door was twisted and bent. Laurie saw his soiled, heavy work overalls and work jacket. Ted noticed the light that they had seen earlier came from a small lantern in the man's right hand. Jess, the last one through the door, observed a scar on the man's cheek and saw him looking at a large pocket watch. Just then a blinding bolt of lightning struck the tunnel entrance and ricocheted directly into the man. Deafened by the crash of thunder, Jess screamed in horror as his arms were flung wide and something flew past her. The man disappeared before her eyes in a blinding burst of light, literally vaporized by the enormous lightning bolt. The small lantern he held flared and fell to the ground in a molten puddle. The metal door slammed shut behind them with a clang, and they stood in total darkness. They heard the roar of the tornado as it passed over the ridgeline, and they heard trees thudding on the ground overhead. Then, at last, it grew quiet. Stunned, they did nothing but listen for a moment or two. Then they began to fumble in their packs for flashlights. "Jess, are you okay?" Dave sounded a little worried, which was unusual. Before she could answer, Ted and Laurie gasped almost together. "What's that?" They gaped at a tennis ball-sized globe of white light as it appeared barely 15 feet from them. They heard Jess gasp, and a few seconds later the globe of light shot towards the ceiling and disappeared. Dave blurted, "What? Where?" Finally, everyone but Jess found a flashlight and turned them on. They were in a rectangular room about 12 by 20 feet. The walls were painted brick. They had been white at one time, but they were a sooty, dirty gray now. The floor was bare concrete, and the ceiling frame was wooden. Several old desks and wooden chairs lined the far wall. The door they had entered was the room's only door, except for an open closet. Dust was on the furniture and the floor, very thickly. Ted immediately went to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Laurie went to help him, but even together they couldn't get it open. "It feels like there's a wall on the other side," Ted grumbled. Dave turned to help them, but then he saw Jess standing motionless, her arms folded. Tears were trickling down her cheeks. Startled, he went straight to her. "Are you okay? What is it, honey? What happened?" "That poor man," was all she could gasp. "What man? What are you talking about?" He put his arms around her. "The lineman who let us in here. A huge bolt of lightning hit him," she sobbed. "What? Where is he?" "He's gone! The lightning just vaporized him. I saw it happen. And then, after the door slammed and the tornado went overhead, I saw him in here, right over there." Ted and Laurie had come to join their friends and stared at each other when they saw where Jess pointed. She pointed at the exact spot where they had seen that globe of light. Dave was confused. "I didn't see anyone at all. It was dark." "I saw him standing right there. He looked at me, straight at me, and he said, 'Remember.' Not out loud, but it was like he spoke in my head in a deep voice, and he pointed towards that desk right over there." She indicated the desk in the corner. Ted and Laurie aimed their flashlights at it. "Just looks like an old desk." "Ted, what's that on the floor underneath it? Looks like metal." Laurie moved towards the desk, but Jess was there first, on her hands and knees. "Oh my God, it's his pocket watch! It's the watch he had in his hand when the lightning hit him. The shock must have spasmed his arm. The watch flew right past me into the room." "Are you sure?" Now Dave was really confused. "Yes, I'm sure. I saw it happen. Didn't you see it?" "No, I didn't. I mean, I believe you, but I didn't see anything." Jess held the watch in her hands, staring at the cracked watch crystal. "It stopped at 4:02. That must be when the lightning hit." "I bet you're right." Ted checked his own wristwatch. "It's about 10 after now." Jess turned it over. "It has the initials WRE engraved on the back of the case. I wonder what his name was." Laurie looked around as if expecting to see the ghost again, or a globe of light. "Keep the watch for now," she said. "We can take it back to camp and see if the caretaker knows anything about it, or who it might belong to. Let's see if we can get that door open." "Okay, shine a light for us, Laurie." She did. Dave and Ted braced themselves to rush the door several steps away. "On three. Ready? 1, 2, 3!" They hit the door together and it burst open, clanging against the wall of the tunnel. Dave and Ted caught their balance outside. As Laurie and Jess walked out the door, they looked at the sky. It was still sprinkling, but the clouds looked more normal and seemed to be breaking up. "Hey, what's this?" When Dave caught his balance right outside the door, he had almost put his hand on an odd-looking piece of metal. Now he picked it up. "Look!" They all looked at the irregular piece of metal. It was about 9 inches long, 6 inches wide, and about a half-inch thick in the middle. It included a melted chunk of glass near the middle also, and it looked like old brass. Jess took it from Dave. "That's what's left of his lantern. It must have melted when the lightning hit it." Jess gingerly wrapped the watch in a t-shirt and placed it with the lump of metal in her pack. She glanced one last time into the tunnel room, then shut the door. "When it stops raining, we better get back to camp before anything else happens." They all agreed with that, and fortunately they didn't have long to wait. They walked through the tunnel and returned to the trail on the other side. The trail was more slippery now, but they pushed on until they reached the camp. As they walked past the caretaker's cottage, the man hurried out to meet them. "I'm afraid I have some bad news for you," he said as they walked towards their site. "We had some big, high winds here with that storm, and it brought down a few trees." "Wow, I'll say!" exclaimed Dave as their campsite came into view. They had pitched their tents side by side the previous day, clear of the surrounding trees in case of rain. However, a huge tree from the perimeter had blown down in the storm, and now its trunk lay diagonally across their tents. Broken branches littered the clearing and wet leaves stuck to everything. "Well, it looks like we have some work to do before dinner. Let's get busy," said Dave. "I'll help. I have 2 chainsaws and a bow saw," said the caretaker. Several hours later they finally finished. It was getting dark, but now at least they could get into their tents. Other than bent tent poles and a broken picnic table, nothing else was seriously damaged. "I won't make you cook dinner after all that," said the caretaker. "You've saved me several days of hard work cutting up that tree. I'll order us pizza, my treat." "All right!" exclaimed Dave. The others agreed. Later, as they polished off the pizza, they asked the caretaker about the haunting of the tunnel. He explained to them that, according to local lore, a lineman had become drunk one stormy evening back in the 19th century. He heard an approaching train and rushed out to alert them to high winds and fallen trees further up the line. In his condition and in his haste, the man apparently forgot to turn up his lantern. He must have fallen across the tracks and been run over by the train, but strangely his body was never found, and his disappearance remained a mystery to this day. Oddly enough, when his ghost was seen nowadays, or at least they assumed it was his ghost, it usually disappeared into the wall of the tunnel. But the tunnel wall was solid brick. No one could explain that. "Yep, that story never did add up. He was a good man with a spotless record," said the caretaker. "Wild horses couldn't have dragged him away from that job when he was on duty. That's just the way he was. And he never drank at all. His wife was in the anti-saloon league, and he agreed with her. How he disappeared, though, no one knows." Jess thought of the watch they had found. "Does anybody remember his name?" The caretaker hesitated. "Well, yes, they do. His full name was William Rutherford Evans, and he was my grandfather." "Oh, my God!" Jess exclaimed. "It was him that we saw!" "What's the matter?" smiled the caretaker. "Did you see a ghost today?" Jess mastered her emotions with visible effort. "We all saw a man in the tunnel today, during the storm. We have no idea who he was, because we've never seen him before. But let us describe him to you. He had a pale face, with bushy eyebrows, and a huge soup strainer mustache. His eyes and his hair were light-colored, and he had a scar on his right cheek. He was solidly built, about 6 inches taller than I am, because when I stepped up into the tunnel room, I looked back at him, and we were right at eye level. His left hand was all twisted and bent, like it had been injured and never healed right," said Dave, "but he still held the door open for us." "He wore stained coveralls and a work jacket," added Laurie. "He carried a small lantern in his right hand. The light wasn't bright, but we saw it through the pouring rain," said Ted. "He motioned us to hurry, to go through the door into the tunnel wall. We were all safe in there, but he never joined us," explained Ted. The caretaker wasn't smiling any more. "You described my grandfather all right. Dad said he started as a brakeman, but his hand got crushed. It never healed right, so they made him a lineman. I have an old daguerreotype picture of my grandfather that I can show to you." He left the table and soon returned with a small black and white image. "That's him!" they all blurted when they saw it. And you say he didn't follow you through the door?" mused the caretaker. "No, and that was the horrible part," Jess continued. "I was the last through the door, and I turned around to say something to him. He was looking at his big pocket watch, and right then a blinding bolt of lightning struck the tunnel entrance and ricocheted directly into him. His arms flung wide, and the watch flew past me like a missile into the room. The lightning must have vaporized him, because he disappeared right before my eyes in a burst of light. The lightning bolt melted his lantern also. It was like a nightmare. I'll never forget it as long as I live." Jess shivered as she saw it again in her memory. The caretaker was quiet for a long time, looking down at the table. Finally he stirred. "That would explain a few things, I guess, if that's what happened. Too bad we'll never be able to prove it." "Maybe we can. Let me get what we found from my pack. I'll be right back," said Jess. She dashed out the door of the cottage, headed for their campsite. "Mr. Evans, we did find a watch, and Jess is convinced that it was the one he was holding when the lightning struck him. And we found what could have been a small brass lantern, but it was completely melted. We brought them back with us," said Ted. The caretaker's voice shook a little. Can I see them?" "Sure." Moments later Jess returned. She held her T-shirt, still wrapped around the pocket watch, and had the melted lantern on top. She placed them on the table. "This is what we thought might be the melted lantern. It looks like the metal fused right to the glass. And here," she unfolded the T-shirt, "is his pocket watch. It has the initials WRE engraved on the back. The crystal was cracked when we found it. We think it stopped at the time the lightning bolt hit it." The caretaker's hands were shaking as he gently examined the pocket watch. He turned it over and over. Finally he pressed a button on the side, and it popped open. Inside the lid was mounted a small winding key, encircled by the words "Official Railroad Timepiece." The caretaker closed the lid again and sat still, awestruck. "I never saw Grandfather's watch. He was gone long before I was born. But Father described it to me, and I would swear that this was it. It even has his initials on it." He looked at it longingly, and then handed it back to Jess. She immediately put it back in his palm. "Seems like it should stay in the family, don't you think?" "I think that's what he wanted. I saw him briefly after he was struck, in the room where we were. He looked straight at me and said, 'Remember,' in my mind. I got the idea he had a deep voice. I think he wanted his family to know how he died. If we saw what actually happened, it sure wasn't from alcohol, or being hit by a train, or abandoning his post." "Yes, you're right. Thank you. It means so much to take away the shame that we all felt as his family, even after all these years. We never knew what happened to him, and it seemed like no one else really cared. We never believed the official story." He paused, then added, "And Father told me that Grandfather had a very deep voice." "Well, I guess that clears up the mystery," said Ted. "Yes, all but one part," said Mr. Evans. "What's that?" said Laurie. No one has ever known the tunnel had a maintenance office in the wall. Maybe that's what he disappeared into when people see him vanish." "Can you show me where it is?" "Sure, we'll go there tomorrow before we leave." They went to the tunnel the next morning, and to their amazement saw no door in the wall. They did search the wall closely where they expected it to be, and found that a doorway-sized section of wall had been bricked up and painted over. The 4 hikers had to go home, but the caretaker wrote them about a month later. With permission of the park authorities, he had chipped out the added section of brick and exposed a rusted metal door. Prying it open with a crowbar, he found the dusty room with the desks and chairs just as they had said. In the corner desk side drawer, he found an old railroad maintenance request form under several blank sheets. At the bottom it was signed in blue ink, "Completed, William R. Evans," and dated August 1882, about a week before his disappearance. The caretaker also reported later that he and his family had held a memorial service for his grandfather. Interestingly enough, the ghost has not been seen in the tunnel since that service, which took place in 1961.